Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Empower Asian America, the Teahouse edition, where I sit with wonderful guests from wonderful parts all over the world. And we talk about art. We talk about the Asian American and Pacific Islander experience. And today I'm joined by a wonderful guest, a filmmaker named Chelsie, who will introduce herself now.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, Min. I'm Chelsie. I'm based in Washington, D.C. I'm a full-time video producer during my day job. And then outside of my day job, I'm an indie film director and writer. So I'm currently working on my latest project called Mandarins, which is a short film set in Washington, D.C.'s Chinatown that explores intergenerational trauma and forgiveness through an Asian American lens. I guess an intro into how I got into filmmaking. I actually studied film in college at upstate New York at Syracuse. I was introduced to Wong Kar-wai through one of my directing classes. Yes, that's what I like to see. Basically, I was shown like a clip from one of his films. You're going through like clips of a bunch of different films. And I was like, just in awe of what I saw from like that short clip. Immediately went home, binge watched his films, and I was hooked at that point. I was like, I need to make something like this. I didn't even know that films could be like this. And so I made a couple films in college. The first one was Kill Green. If you've seen it, or if you do watch it, and if you are familiar with Wong Kar-wai, it's pretty obviously like a direct, I guess, sort of interpretation of trying to like do things stylistically similarly with that sort of slow motion shots and these very like bright color palettes. Surprisingly, though, it was made with, like a $200 budget with a couple of my friends at school, where we would just work on things until 2, 3, 4 a.m. I got into a couple of festivals, and I was like, holy shit, because when I had first started making it, I wasn't thinking about those things. And I was like, wow, okay, this is something I should do maybe.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's how I got into it. Worked in video, corporate video producing for the last couple of years, and am ready to do my biggest project yet.
So for this interview, we're going to do things a little bit differently. We're going to talk about your culture first. And actually, one of the questions I was thinking about asking you was, who are your inspirations? But let's just dive right into that, because we are having like a connection right now. I freaking love that man's work. His work is so profoundly emotionally intellectual. It is so brilliant. I think like there's a little bit of a Hitchcockian element to it, along with like some older noir elements as well. I think, don't quote me on this one, I think one of his major inspirations was Vertigo, especially with like the color palettes and stuff like that. But I want to
see that. Yeah.
What is your favorite work by Wong Kar-wai? I'm just curious.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like this is like a pretty basic answer, but it's definitely In the Mood for Love. I feel like that's like, I think like the critics' choice too. And I feel like I can more confidently say that now. I recently acquired the Criterion collection of his works, which started, with his like first films and led all the way up to In the Mood for Love, which is really cool for me as I was watching the films to sort of see his progression in his career and how he was sort of like chipping away at like what I think is like the perfect movie. Mm-hmm. And so it was really interesting to see where he started and how he got to In the Mood for Love. And to be honest, I felt it was such a huge leap from his previous works, where there would be these sort of like long lamenting, like monologues from characters. And then In the Mood for Love sort of stripped all of those away. And then it was all in sort of like the subtext. And then for me, I was like, okay, yeah, like this is what made it brilliant. But yeah, he's continues to be a huge influence on me. I have been this year trying to be holding myself accountable with really watching a lot more films. And because I at least in just what I feel about it is, if you want to be good at an art, you have to consume it and you have to love it. So I'm trying to hold myself accountable to that.
No, that's great advice too for a lot of young filmmakers to hear, is like, if you want to make films, you got to watch films. If you want to be a writer, you got to read books. If you want to be an artist, you better do master studies of other people's work. So
absolutely.
I think that that's phenomenal advice to give. And I'm really happy to hear that you are holding yourself accountable like that. I need to do that as well with my own art and like my own movie watching as well. But yeah, Wong Kar-wai, his work, there is like such a profound, like it's a really beautiful color palettes, beautiful storytelling. And I agree with you. Yes, I'm basic too. Yes, like In the Mood for Love is one of my favorite of his films. And I actually started watching some of your trailers from your previous works. And I can definitely see that influence for sure in your work as well. Like, actually, it's funny. As I was watching one of your trailers, just kind of blind watching it for the first time, I saw the color palettes you were using. And I was like, this reminds me of Vertigo, or this reminds me of like kind of an older style of filmmaking. And it's really nice.
I'm honored.
Yeah. Like, I actually was looking at this and I was like, I'm feeling Hitchcock. I actually did see the Wong Kar-wai, but I was like, is it Wong Kar-wai? Yeah, I'm feeling it. So I definitely can see it there. But now for this part of this interview, let's talk about the culture aspect and who you are as an individual and as an Asian American.
Yeah, so I'm biracial. I'm 50% Chinese, 25% Albanian, and then 25% something else. Not quite sure. But yeah, my mom, she immigrated from Taiwan to America when she was 20. Met my dad in Oregon, and the rest is history. So that's just background of me. But I would say, I know it's sort of, if you're like HAPA, like biracial, there, your experience in terms of like how much you were immersed in culture, and even if you were adopted as well, like it sort of runs the gamut in terms of how exposed you were, or how much, your parent that was tied to that side of your identity, you know, makes it a priority in your life. And I will say for me, I grew up in a very, very Chinese household. My mom only talks to me in Chinese. She texts me in Chinese, like was plopped down into Chinese Sunday school at the age of 2 before I'd even stepped foot into any sort of like American preschool. So yeah, I mean, I feel like my experience with it is just like my whole life, like like that's just how I grew up. And it was, I don't know, I'm very grateful to my mom for doing that. And after having like talked with her a lot more now and like gotten a lot closer to her as I've gone into adulthood, I mean, she's even told me like, yeah, like this was such a big part of me. Like I wanted to make sure that my kids could like speak to me in the language that I knew best, and that, you know, my mom or my popo, like I could speak to her because she only speaks Chinese. She doesn't speak any English. So just very grateful that she.
I totally agree with you. Like, I mean, I think that like, not to sound like super poetic here, I got goosebumps actually as you were talking, because it's like, I think to teach a language or to even learn a new language is a profound act of love. It's a profound act of, you know, because like, you know, my soul, I always say to people, my soul is in Vietnamese. You know, when you speak to me in that language, you're speaking directly to my spirit. And I mean that quite seriously. So like, whenever I hear people having these conversations with their parents, having those, you know, learning experiences, or that reclamation of their culture, or that, you know, those kinds of conversations, I think that they're so powerful and so impactful. And I really appreciate you sharing that with me just now. And I kind of want to dive deeper into that a little bit more. Yeah. And talk about some of those core memories, maybe one core memory that maybe shaped this film, or not even maybe this film, maybe just you as an individual Asian American person.
I guess we're going to talk about sort of what inspired the film. It's definitely been, and this is something that I feel like a lot of us go through as like sort of that third culture Asian America, an Asian American experience, and growing up, you know, like second gen. I definitely went through a period of time in high school where, you know, that side of you, that part of your identity is not cool. It's not cool that your mom is speaking to you in this different language in front of your friends. It's not cool, the food that you love, but you no longer want to like bring to school for lunch because it's like weird. And I feel like I definitely went through a phase like that. And I don't think it's an uncommon thing. I feel like, you know, because your maturity level at that age is of a teenager. And all you want to do is fit in. And so definitely had some of that going on. And then also just sort of not understanding, you know, my household was very Chinese. And then, you know, the school world was like very Western and very American. And there's also often like clashing of sort of like what my mom expected and then what like my school friends did, and, you know, like hanging out all the time and like always being away from home. And like, that's something I feel like usually like Asian parents are like, wait, what? What is that?
Right, yeah, exactly.
And, you know, just like, you know, dying on these very stupid hills with my mom in high school and getting into fights over stupid things like that. And then going into college and being on my own for the first time and having this sort of like slow and steady, like appreciation, I think, just for everything that she'd done for me. And then it was also around that time that I started to have these longer conversations with her. I felt like the longer I was away from my mom, the time that we were together became like more precious and special than how like high school, where it was like you see her every day and it's just like, fighting all the time. And so we started to like really talk, and I started to learn about her past and her upbringing and our extended family, and sort of solidified, I think, my appreciation for her by being able to like learn about her as like a human outside of just being a mom figure, which I feel like is very easy for us to just be like, yeah, this is mom, and that's what she's always been. But it's like, oh, no, she was like a whole person before she had me. And just learning about her past and realizing that a lot of, the way she is informed by that. And everything sort of made a little more sense, I feel like. And so this film has sort of been a reflection of, and I don't want to say it's just based off my mom, because I don't think that. It's also based on like me learning about her relationship with her own mom, and how there's sort of like the same kind of thing that I had gone through with her, and my cousins with my aunts, and this sort of like circle of like, pushing people away or being angry, or just holding on to like anger or resentment, and then sort of like finding your way back in full circle of this like deep appreciation and like learning to forgive for like the right reasons. So those have been things that I've been thinking about over the last 3-4 years, and finally decided it was time to work on another creative project outside of school, which is a whole nother thing in itself to get started with. And so this is really a film based on those ruminations and viewing forgiveness as a way to sort of end these cycles.
No, I really think that's beautiful. I'm like, again, like I'm just feeling the emotion behind your words. And I almost want to echo and hone in on something that you said I thought was very interesting, is that you're right. I think that Asian Americans, especially from immigrant or refugee backgrounds, can relate to what you're saying, because, oftentimes we tend to hyperfixate on our parents' struggle. We hyperfixate on the things that they've sacrificed for us, the things that they've given up, that, for us to have a better life, for us to have the life that we've always wanted, that we tend to forget that they are, like you said, whole people with like their own lives and their own joys and their own inspirations. So I love that, definitely. I always tell people, it's like, I look at my parents and I think like, I see their struggle and I am inspired by their resilience, but their joy and their humanity has also inspired me as well. And I want to talk about that even further, because this film is very sacred in that relationship of motherhood and daughterhood and that kind of intersection. So I want to kind of drive the conversation into talking about how those intersections, you being an Asian biracial woman with your Asian mother, and how those intersections have impacted you as an individual or this film.
Yeah, I mean, basically my connection to my Asian side has been almost entirely through Chinese women. Basically, like so much of my identity with like Asian America is tied in with womanhood too, because these are like the prominent, like loud, wonderful and perfect people that I've just like been around and grown up around. I honestly feel like every work that I'm going to continue make, beyond this film is probably going to just keep featuring complex Asian women, because, I'm not seeing much of it like in mainstream media or whatever. Absolutely. So it's like, I like, even if, but this one's like pretty intrinsically tied to a cultural world. But I think for future projects, even if I do something that maybe doesn't like center exactly like Asian American identity, that I'll still continue to cast Asian women in it, because that's just like, I just want to see them in films, like, to be honest. And that's another thing too, just with women characters as well. I feel like I'm very, very drawn to complex women who are flawed, who fail and do so earnestly. I have a lot of film influences, and a lot of them tend to be men directors. And that is something that I'm trying to like, you can't complain about most of the directors being male when that's like all you watch. Like, you need to like actually hold yourself accountable here, Chelsea, and seek out female directors and start watching the work. So that is something that I'm trying to do now. But I feel like a lot of my influences have been men directors, and I still do see this sort of like lack of any sort of the kind of woman characters that I want to see.
Right.
Especially just because I've been around these characters my life, and they're so cool, and there's so much to explore, and they're so complex. And it's like, I feel like it's just sort of a waste if we don't start to explore like these kinds of characters who don't just follow into the trope of just like forlorn lover or like tragic mother or daughter who just, you know, reacts to the actual action happening in the movie rather than like getting their own story explored. So yeah, that's, I think for this project and future projects, it's definitely something that, I mean, that's just who I am, and that's my identity, and that's who I've been around. Like, I want to keep making things that have Asian women and explore complex Asian women in them.
No, I love that. And like, I think that, you know, I was talking to Tammy about this just the other day, actually, is that I think that now we're at this interesting kind of like a renaissance in Asian American and diasporic films. So don't quote me on this, but I think like, you know, in 1994, the Joy Luck Club came out. And then that was the first live action, fully Asian American cast that we've had since like Flower Song Dance back in like the 60s, I believe. And then like with Crazy Rich Asians that came out in, I believe, 2018, that is a 24-year gap in a lack of representation. That's a whole person that like went through college, you know, like a whole person was born and like existed and didn't have a whole cast of just Asian American people. So now we're at this like interesting point where we're seeing more directors coming out. And I totally agree with you. It's like, I'm thinking that too. Like I watch a lot of male directors but there really aren't that many. There are definitely out there for sure. They exist, but they're not being featured. They're being, you know, marginalized. They're not getting the voices that they deserve. And I'm like actively trying to find them out.
Right. Yeah. It feels like you have to find them rather than hearing about it for all the other ones. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
But I want to shift gears now, and I want to talk more about your film and just like the concept behind it, and like just a brief log line just for our audience. And for this part of the interview, we're going to move on to the industry part where we get to talk about the filmmaking process itself and the challenges in the script writing and the challenges in finding the team, et cetera, et cetera. So let's hear about it.
Yeah, so the film follows a black sheep. She's been estranged from her family for several years, and her name is Olivia Chu, and she decides to sort of last minute or spontaneously show up to the funeral of her mother unannounced, which her siblings, Michael and Jenny, are there and have sort of set things up for her. So she basically shows up to the funeral unannounced, and she decides that she wants to speak, even though she hasn't seen these people. She hasn't been a part of the culture, and it had sort of rejected her culture for years. And so she decides to say something about her mother, who she's had this obviously complicated relationship with. And she's sort of doing her best to honor her and sort of capture her relationship with her and forgive, and while all doing this through guilt and grief and anger. And she ends up delivering this sort of offbeat eulogy about a story her mother once told her. And that results in her siblings having to save face in front of friends and family, sort of in the aftermath of her offbeat eulogy that wasn't necessarily appropriate. So it follows basically a character that fails and continues to fail throughout the whole thing. But through her failures, she is sort of the sibling that inches closest to a peace and sort of a inner resolution, or at least the start of one. But I wanted to use the three characters of the siblings to sort of highlight how intergenerational trauma can play out through different siblings. It doesn't look the same in each person, and each person may have reacted in a certain way towards it. So the whole story sort of follows these line of like competing eulogies that the siblings do about their mom, which also sort of paints the picture of the mom, who is the other character in the room with sort of no voice. And yeah, so that's the premise of the film. And part of the reason why I decided to do it this way was I think I just wanted to like really create like this new world outside of, I think, my own life. It's very like, this is obviously a very personal story, but it's with these completely sort of like fictional characters. And exploring it through that way to sort of like remove myself by a layer, which has been really fun because I've been able to see the story evolve even further as we've gone throughout the pre-production process and as we've gone through casting. But yeah.
No, absolutely.
Right, that was sort of a convoluted way.
Oh, no. And I want to pick your brain a little bit because you mentioned like, these characters without like spoiling the plot, because I want people to watch this film and I want people to be engaged with it. But you're right, is that, there is different interpretations that, family members can have about an individual. And especially they come from different diasporic experiences. So out of just my own curiosity, are the other siblings, are they her generation? Are they generation, I assume that she's generation 2, correct? As in she was born and raised in America. Is this correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So in the story, all 3 of the siblings are Asian American, and I consider this to be a very Asian American story. Mm-hmm. They're sort of doing their best to follow the traditions of a Chinese funeral, but obviously it's not following it to a T because they don't fully know themselves, right? They're doing their best and they're holding it in this community center that they had grown up with, sort of the elderly adults, now elderly adults around them, like attending the funeral. So yeah, it's definitely an exploration of how people can react differently to intergenerational trauma. For example, the character of Michael, he's sort of like the quintessential eldest son, went to Wharton Business School and sort of like did as he was told his whole life, and was led there. But feels sort of guilt about the preferential treatment his mother gave him his whole life. And then there's Jenny, who's like the obedient daughter who made sure that Michael was set up for success without thinking about herself. And you can see her sort of cling to sort of a narrative that she's told herself for why Michael has success and why that's important. And then there's Olivia, who is the black sheep. And despite being the black sheep and despite outwardly failing so much, is the sibling out of the 3 that gets the closest to ending it.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, and I think that's interesting because now I want to ask, are they all generation 2 or are there characters that are generation 1.5? And for my viewers who don't know what generation 1.5 is that it is typically an Asian American child that immigrated to the United States when they were either a minor, so like a young infant child, or I think the cutoff for generation 1.5 is 18, as long as they're in that young adolescent age. So are all of them second generation, or is there any 1.5 children in this family?
Yeah, so I actually think there's some room for interpretation. None of that is sort of outwardly said, but I think the Asian Americanness does come across for sure, especially with the amount of Chinglish involved in their monologues. But I could see Michael being 1.5 or 2. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so I'm always interested in audiences' interpretations of things because it's usually pretty different from maybe original ideas behind things. But it's honestly exciting for me when the story starts to remove itself from me and become its own thing. And that is such a beautiful answer to hear from a filmmaker. I love when I hear filmmakers say that because, it's kind of like the, what was it, the saying? It's like the author's dead or whatever else. And it's you see how other people interpret it. And I like actually that you left it up for interpretation because in my mind, I assume that Michael could be generation 1.5 based on the sociological data that we have about generation 1.5. But maybe another Asian American would be like, no, Michael reminds me of my brother who's generation 2. So, mm-hmm. I like how that isn't really, set up in stone. So that's really interesting for me to hear. And now I want to switch gears a little bit and I want to talk about, those little nuances in that writing process. In how did you come up with these characters? Because you said you had to kind of really remove yourself from the situation, to have that kind of cognitive dissonance to make this art. So what were some of the challenges in writing this script, or perhaps finding the right team for this in terms of the actors, et cetera, et cetera? So many challenges. Yeah. I think with this script, I think the main challenge was really writing it and getting it done, to be honest. I basically had been went straight into a video producing job in, corporate America right after graduation. That was, 3.5 years ago. I had always had in the back of my mind, I'm going to do this dream of mine. I'm going to direct, I'm going to continue to direct films, but it just sort of, the years went by and it just hadn't happened. And then I finally was like, okay, actually it started with me getting into film school, realizing that it was way too expensive. And then being like, okay, well, if I don't go, I need to do something. I need to do something for myself. I can't just sit around and mope and be angry at the world that I don't have that much free time to work on stuff. You need to get over yourself and you need to like you need to do it for yourself. And you need to commit to doing it for yourself. So started writing the script. First draft was terrible. And I think the challenge was really working on something that I didn't think was good every single day. And, you know, I feel like it can be very like dejecting when you read it and you're like, oh my God, I hate this. Like and this is 3 years out from like any sort of success I had in college with my previous films, and sort of doubting myself and fighting through the feelings of like, who do I think I am? Why am I spending my time on this? Like, this isn't ever going to get made, and trying to basically shut up those thoughts as much as possible and like sit down on my laptop, close the work laptop, open my personal laptop and just write. And so that was definitely the biggest challenge for me. And I think I reconnected with an old high school friend around that time. And she was sort of, I feel like the film would not have gotten made without her, to be honest. She was just sort of like my biggest champion and supporter, and was there to tell me that the things I was thinking about myself were stupid. And so I spent basically like a year working on the script, have probably 30, 40 pages of backstory for all these characters before they get to this point. And I think previous iterations had even started with like 5 siblings instead of 3. Mm-hmm. And yeah, so that was definitely the main challenge with the script, was just really fighting myself, which continues to be a challenge in other ways. Mm-hmm. But I feel like that's pretty common for artists, right? Like we're all our worst critics. It's very easy when, you know, you're doing something that doesn't necessarily have, you know, you're doing art for the sake of art. It's very easy to feel like, you know, you're embarrassing yourself or something, or it's like not like worthwhile of spending all your time. But working through that actively every day. And then it was finding a team, which, you know, making a film in college is a whole different ball game from making your first project outside of school. There's sort of, I think there's like a line where it's like, how do you become a director? You either go to film school or you just direct. So I was like, okay, well, you know, I tried the film school thing. I can't afford to take out a $250,000 loan. So I guess I'll just direct. Don't really have the blueprint for it, but I'll try. I randomly had like, I think like DM'd somebody on ShareGrid, like a couple of cinematographers on ShareGrid. It's this like app for renting equipment. That person got back to me 6 months later after I'd forgotten that I had done that. And he was like, have you made this yet? Because I'm interested. And I was like, no, I haven't. Talked to him. He was wonderful. He basically brought in, you know, like half the team. After we were like, yeah, let's work together. He brought in a lot of his friends, local DC people. We made some posts in like Asian Creative Network. That's actually how I ended up being on this podcast here today. And then a couple of other people came from there to join the team. But yeah, so I think, at least for me, I used to be very afraid of reaching out to people, complete strangers, right? Because it's like, you know, why nobody owes me anything. Why on earth would you spend this much time on something that's like not your own per se? And I was just sort of scared to reach out. But my one friend, Christina, she's also an executive producer on the project. She was like, no, you just got to try. You know, the worst thing they can do is say no. And been humbled and sort of found a newfound optimism in how many people will say yes and how many people are willing to help. And we have this fantastic team. I love them. I love like getting on meetings with them every single week. I get excited for them. And the project has definitely taken on like our project, and it feels like it's no longer my project, which I really love. And that's sort of all I can ask for.
No, absolutely. And like, I'm going to echo in on what you just said, because I work in a very adjacent field to you in animation and doing films for animation. And it's the same thing is like, you know, there's this, I feel like this imposter syndrome, like that we have with ourselves in our art. It's like, who would care about, this is my vision. Who would care about my individualistic feelings? But it's like, no, it's like when you work on a film with somebody, and I'm going to tell this directly to our viewers. It's like when you work on a film with somebody, you are also putting a little bit of your soul into the project as well. Because sure, like the films that I work on for animation, they're not my films, like it's another director, but my color palettes go into it. My character designs go into it. My prop designs go into it. That's a little bit of my soul that I see and a little bit of my vision with their vision. It's like an interwoven of ideas coming together. And, you know, I love your film. And even though I come from the Vietnamese diaspora, what you're saying and the thoughts and the feelings and the emotions that you're expressing are part of the greater Asian American diaspora narrative, that someone like me from like, a totally different diaspora, there is that link that I do feel with your work. And I think a lot of other diaspora and even probably mainland Asian American or Asian folks can, relate to as well. So that's something I'd want to say to you, but also directly to our viewers as well, is that, never doubt that, like never ever doubt, like, your individual thoughts and your individual feelings and like the magnitude that they could have on somebody's life,
Yeah, I actually want to touch on that point that you just mentioned and how people can sort of relate to it. I think, when I said about writing this, it wasn't necessarily like a thought in my mind, like, wow, so many people are going to relate to this. Like that wasn't sort of anything that like was like something that I was like thinking about all the time. Like I knew that it came from a real experience, like real feelings. I knew that a lot of my Asian American friends went through the same thing, which is why I had like, sort of a deeper bond with my Asian American friends in high school. And just because they intrinsically understood some of the things that like of that sort of like culture clash that we grew up having. But yeah, so we had posted the casting call in January on Asian Creative Network and these various like Asian actors groups and things on Facebook. And the response we received to it in the casting call questionnaire, like it really like blew me away. Like I had no idea how many people wanted to see something like this. I had no idea how many people could relate to a story. Like I truly did not anticipate or foresee. And it's sort of like, I remember like reading the responses in like the casting call Google form we sent out. And there was like some 2 basic questions that were like, why do you want to work on this project? Which character do you see yourself the most? And people were just pouring their hearts out in it. And we're like, oh my gosh, like, I'm so happy you're making this. Like I'm this character, like I can really, really relate to this. Or like, I'm so happy that, there's this story that like is like really authentic Asian American experience. It doesn't sort of like check off the diversity box and is something that we have all, like a lot of us have gone through. So yeah, I mean, I think for me, I had no idea that the reaction would be that way. And it's just been so heartwarming. Like the fire that was already lit grew even brighter for being like, we have to make this, like we have to make it.
I want to really hone in on what you just said about like that relatability aspect, because, and something you said earlier in the interview is like that a lot of Asian Americans feel is like that concept that they're not relatable, like their food is not relatable, their language is not relatable. They feel like constantly, at least in this interview, like you and me have definitely felt these feelings that we've had to minimalize ourselves down, shrink ourselves down to like make ourselves more palatable for other people. During this filming process, you mentioned that this is specifically a Chinese style funeral ritual. Like, was there a point where that kind of insecurity popped up maybe in your process where like, can people relate to this? And like the differences between a Chinese practice in a funeral versus like a more Western one. I want to talk about that element a little bit more, about like, how you encompassed in that culture. And, there are points like, so for example, when I watch anime, sometimes in the anime, like, because they recognize that it's a global market, like they explain certain features about like certain customs and certain practices. Does your film go into that? Or is it, just like a very natural, like mise en scène kind of thing where you just kind of just follow the characters through and it's a very natural flow?
I think a lot of what I tried to do from this one is really like use the subtext to tell the story, because it's really 3 characters telling stories, responding to each other's stories with a story of their own. And so it's through these sort of like facades that they put on and their interpretations of their past and their relationship with their mom. That's how you get the bigger picture of who each of these people are, who their mom was in all 3 of these stories, and sort of why they are the way that they are. And so I think with like the specific cultural elements, to be honest, I feel very strongly that I'm not going to dim down cultural elements. I feel like with, major films that have like full white casts or whatever, like nobody's asking, will the Asian American community see themselves in this film? Will they feel alienated by this? Nobody asked that, And so making this film, like, I'm not like, oh no, like, will white people not be able to relate to this film? I just sort of am like, why do I have to consider that?
Right.
To be honest.
Exactly.
Like, I think it's a universal story. I do. It's about forgiveness. What's more universal than that? We've all struggled with that before. And so I do think you can relate if you want to, but I'm not going to like take away certain things because I'm afraid that people outside the Asian American community can't relate. Like, why can't we make something for ourselves?
Exactly. No, exactly. Exactly. And like, I feel like that's something that I hear from a lot of like, students that I've taught in the past when I was a student teacher in my master's degree, is like, they're wanting to make, films where, they're talking about their Asian American identity and they're thinking like, oh, maybe I'll just remove like this Buddhist element out. Like no one's going to connect to it, or I'll remove this Hindu element out. I'll substitute. No, keep that in there. Like, no. Like if this is your experience, keep it in there.
Yeah. It just feels like it sort of cheapens the story, which I feel like is exactly the opposite of what I want to do here and what I want to do with the stories that I do tell, right? Like there is a new wave of Asian Americans being seen somewhat and actually having like financing for these kind of stories. I mean, I feel like even just with the response from these casting calls and stuff, there is definitely still just this strong desire from a lot of us to see the things that we know so well, but have never seen in media. Mm-hmm. And I think, the relationship with the parents and the dealing with the cultural clashes, and a lot of us having this like full circle moment of like rejecting the culture and then coming back to it, and seeing our parents as like loving parents that are imperfect. Like I've never seen that, to be honest. I've never seen it. And it was such a big part of my life growing up that like it's just nice. It's just nice to make stuff like this. And I don't want to cheapen it in any way. Like I want to tell it authentically.
I think that's really empowering for a lot of people to hear, because no, seriously, like the reason why I bring that up quite seriously is that I remember just working with some other students is that they feel this really sad and unfortunate need to have to minimalize their art, minimalize themselves. Honestly, I felt that way too about like my own, like, illustration art for a certain time. I didn't want to draw Buddhist art because I just felt like it's not marketable. No one's going to understand it, but that's silly. And I'm 27 years old, by the way, and I'm having those kinds of thoughts at 27 years old. So I think I want to end this interview on what you would like to see for the future of Asian American creatives in this industry, and how you feel about where this industry is going, and some challenges that you still see ahead, some things that you could see or that you'd like to see in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the simple answer is I just want to see more authentic stories that tell them in a way where you've done your due diligence with it, where it's not just sort of like a throwaway like checkbox. Because I feel like I see a lot of that, right? That shift towards like diversity. Diversity is cool. We need to make sure the cast is diverse. We need to have like every color of every face on screen. But then those characters, are just like really not given the time or energy, and it almost feels worse in a way.
Yes, absolutely. It's insulting. Yeah, no, I agree with you. It's insulting. Like it's like you're just having a face there, and it's a face where it's like, for example, like, the early 2000s when I grew up, I saw like, this trope of like the cool Asian girl with like the streak in her hair.
Oh yeah.
What province is she from? What province is her family from? Is she a practicing Buddhist? Is she a Shinto? Is she, practicing the Shinto faith? Like, what is her upbringing? What's going on in her family life, And it's just like having just a cool Asian or like a nerdy Asian that's like a stereotype. It's insulting. It completely is. And it's just like based on whose perception. So I totally agree with you there. And it's just, she's there for diversity, but what kind of diversity are you bringing to that table? And who are you representing? Are you representing Asian Americans? Or are you representing the idea that Westerners have about Asian Americans?
Yeah. And just sort of bringing humanity to those faces. I just like, I don't know. I just feel like actually making them complex people with problems who are, you know, imperfect and who fail and who succeed in different ways and have challenges that, I don't know. I just feel like, you know, like the leading man character who gets to do all these cool things in films. Like, I just like don't see enough of it for like women, or just like, I mean, even more so Asian women. And I think, yeah, I mean, even if films, you know, aren't, you know, based super very much in like, you know, the cultural aspects, like how the short film mine is, it's definitely very cultural. But I mean, I have ideas swirling around for feature film in the future. And that one I think will probably stray away from explicitly being like as cultural, but I definitely like still want the character to be an Asian woman, just, you know, just because like, yeah, I just, you know, I don't see it enough. It's like people aren't casting like Asian women in these roles. So it's like, well, then I'll just keep doing it for mine.
No, I love that. Like, no, I love that. No, it's true. Like, I love that so much. And I think like, yeah, we're on a great trajectory for that kind of representation. And like, that's my big hope too, is I want to see more complex stories as well, just like you, because, you know, we are lacking in that, where it's just, yeah, you hit the nail on the head when you said that. It's just, I just see a face just for the sake of diversity. It's insulting. Like, it doesn't get the point across. It doesn't get anything done. It's just a shell. It's a shell. So yeah, definitely. But I'm really happy about this project that you've done. And
thank you.
I wanted to ask you, I think like just like the fun, kind of a fun final question, like a fun thing is like, what is an Asian American diaspora film that you've loved that was like really like, you know, moved you recently?
I would definitely say Minari. Yes. It was so good. I also really like Steven Yeun, so he's just so pretty. Yeah, he's just such a pretty boy. But yeah, I loved that film. Like that kind of stuff. That's like it was so Asian American. It was so and that third culture Asian American. That's actually like a quote from him from like one of his articles talking about the film. How you know, where it's not necessarily like you're not full like mainland Asian, and you're not full like Western American. You're really in between, and we're sort of like forging our own third culture. So that came from him. But yeah, I really felt that in that film, and the composer in particular for that film, Emil Moseri. I might be butchering the last name there, but I had been really into his film score since Last Black Man in San Francisco, which is one of my favorite films of like the last 4 or 5 years for sure. But he scored Minari as well. Wow, and I think it was like my top, like, you know, like the Spotify Unwrapped thing at the end, like my most like listened to thing was like the Minari soundtrack. It's just so good. But yeah, I think definitely with that, you know, just that image of Steven Yeun and like the red baseball cap on the tractor, just love to see it. Yeah. Like love it so much. Or it's just this like very American story, but with an Asian face. Like we just need more of that. You know, we need more stories that humanize us, that take the time to tell these things that haven't been told before, but that we're also familiar with. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of them. And I do want to add, I just want to encourage people who are wanting to delve into making their own projects or making their own films, because I feel like a lot of it is that sort of fear of doing the thing that holds you back. I know it was for me. It took so much of like getting over my fear of believing that the project wouldn't happen, or that it wasn't good enough, or that anybody like wouldn't put the time into it. Or like a team wouldn't be interested. What my friend liked to say was I had sort of planted the seeds for a year of working on this project for so long that like when the team did form, it wasn't an accident, right? Like I had done the work of like giving like all of my passion into this project. And I just want to encourage people, if they're considering it, to do that as well. Because I feel like in a lot of ways, if you don't come from like an upper class background, things are just a lot harder to do. But then it takes away all these like very rich stories that'll never see the light of day, that absolutely should be told. So yeah, just want to see more people like succeed and like do the thing and like make the story that's been in their hearts for so long, because I feel like we're missing out.
And, I definitely want to have you back on when this film is made and, when it's going out to festival, because I definitely want to touch base with you again and, have another conversation where we talk about, the directing part of it, talking about the production part of it as well.
Yeah.
Like as it hits festival and we can talk more. But for right now, what a joy. It was really a joy to sit with you. Like I mean it. Like there were like 3 or 4 times when you're talking, I'm like feeling it. Like I had goosebumps. And your story was beautiful. And I wish it all the success at festivals. I wish it every single amount of success.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for being here. So once again, this is Empower Asian America, the Teahouse edition, where I sit with wonderful guests from wonderful places all around the world. We talk about the Asian American experience. We talk about art. We talk about the creative fields, and we're signing out. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.